In 2014, a team of forensic psychiatrists published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences the results of an experiment that few took seriously at first. For 3 years, they had watched 400 films, not for pleasure, to answer a single question. Of all the serial killers cinema has created in a century of history, how many would actually pass a real forensic exam? The tool they used was the PCL-R, the psychopathy scale developed by Canadian psychologist Robert Hare. The clinical standard instrument specialists used to evaluate psychopathy in real cases. They identified 126 characters, and what they found destroys the map cinema has been drawing for decades. There's a useful thought experiment for understanding why Michael Myers opens this list from the wrong end. Describe the character to a forensic psychiatrist without telling them he's from a movie. What you'll get isn't a diagnosis, it's a list of incompatibilities. Myers is not a psychopath in the clinical sense. He's not psychotic. He's not dissociative. The Leistedt and Linkowski study classifies him as clinically irrelevant. A character who accumulates traits from multiple incompatible disorders and combines them with a physical resilience that has no basis in any known condition. He doesn't fit any category. He's something cinema invented because no real category was terrifying enough. John Carpenter was 28 years old and had $325,000 when he shot it. 20 days of work. A crew recycling equipment from a previous production. The film that grossed $70 million worldwide and permanently changed the way mainstream cinema understands fear. Carpenter explained it in several interviews over the years. He designed Myers to be incomprehensible. He didn't want viewers to be able to analyze him, because the moment they do, they stop being afraid. The absence of any articulable motive was a deliberate artistic decision, not a screenwriting oversight. Myers doesn't kill for reasons we can understand. He is evil as an abstract concept, not an individual with a clinical history. And what nobody tells you is that this concept was built with the most modest means possible. The figure that turned Myers into one of the most recognizable visual icons in horror cinema was born from a decision made in a costume shop with $2 in hand. What makes him a masterpiece of popular horror is exactly what excludes him from this study. Designed to have no possible explanation, he's impossible to evaluate clinically. And that is both his greatest achievement and his greatest limitation at the same time. For decades, whenever cinema needed to portray a disturbed criminal mind, this was the reference. The Bates Motel, the shower, the mother. Norman Bates as the synonym for what someone who seems perfectly normal might be hiding. The problem the study identifies is precise and hard to argue with. Norman Bates is not a psychopath. He's what the researchers call a pseudo-psychopath. His behavior doesn't stem from the emotional detachment and cold calculation that defines clinical psychopathy, but from deep psychosis and traumatic dissociation. His identity has been shattered by trauma. A clinical psychopath doesn't lose awareness of who they are. Bates lost that awareness completely long ago. What lies behind the character is even more disturbing. Ed Gein, the Wisconsin killer who inspired Norman Bates, wasn't a clinical psychopath in the strict sense either. He was something psychiatry at the time didn't quite know how to classify. That same real-life case also inspired Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in part Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. A single man from whom cinema has been borrowing pieces for 70 years to build different monsters. Hitchcock did something that would be unthinkable today to ensure no one knew the plot before release. He personally bought the rights to Robert Bloch's novel for $9,500, a modest sum, and then he ordered every available copy to be bought from bookstores across the United States. The mystery was an asset, and he protected it with money. The irony is that Psycho created the visual language of the modern psychological thriller using a character who, according to forensic science, isn't what he appears to be. The cultural impact is enormous, the clinical accuracy minimal, and curiously, that doesn't diminish what this film means by even a fraction. He's the only killer on this list whose diagnosis appears in the title, and he still doesn't make it. Patrick Bateman, Manhattan investment banker, obsessive business card collector, occasional murderer between business meetings. The character Mary Herron built for her adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis's novel. Christian Bale with the kind of skin that only belongs to someone who has made the maintenance of his image a form of total control. The study's clinical analysis identifies the exact point where the character fails as a real psychopath: status anxiety. Bateman is consumed by the need for social approval. He needs his business card to be better than his colleagues. He needs to be seen. And that, in clinical psychopathy terms, is a fundamental contradiction. A genuine psychopath doesn't seek external validation. The emotional detachment that defines the PCL-R profile includes an indifference to outside judgment that Bateman never once displays. What the character portrays with brutal precision is something else entirely: the psychopathic traits that the corporate financial world not only tolerates but systematically rewards. Calculated coldness, manipulation as a tool for advancement, the absence of empathy as a competitive advantage. The Leistedt study pointed this out explicitly, and it's become one of its most cited findings. Psychopathic traits are disproportionately represented in senior executive environments. American Psycho is a portrait of that, not of pure clinical psychopathy. And the irony is that what makes this film great cinema is exactly what distances it from the forensic exam's results. This is the moment in the video where most viewers are going to disagree, and that disagreement is exactly what makes the study's finding interesting. Hannibal Lecter is not, according to the forensic psychiatrists who analyzed 400 films, a clinically real psychopath. The study says it directly: a fictional archetype of evil, not a clinical portrait. And the reason they give is the most counterintuitive finding of the entire study. A real psychopath is emotionally flat, indifferent. He doesn't cultivate aesthetics. He doesn't monologue. He doesn't invest emotionally in the people around him. The world doesn't matter enough to him to put on a show. Lecter does the exact opposite. He is deeply and intensely interested in Clarice Starling, in opera, in wine, in painting, in mediocrity that offends him almost physically. He has elaborate preferences, cultivated taste, a performative relationship with his own cruelty. That is not clinical psychopathy. It's something cinema invented that has no precise name in any diagnostic manual. The number nobody mentions when talking about this character: Anthony Hopkins appears on screen for approximately 16 minutes in the entire film. With that, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. It's the shortest screen time ever associated with a win in that category in the history of the awards. 16 minutes that built the character who for 30 years has been the cultural benchmark for what a brilliant, merciless killer looks like. A character forensic science says doesn't exist in reality. What nobody says is that Thomas Harris originally based Lecter on a doctor he met in a Mexican prison in the 1970s. A surgeon named Alfredo Bali Trevino, convicted of murder. He wasn't an aesthetic genius or a master of sophisticated manipulation. He was a man in a cell. Cinema turned that starting point into something that had no precedent. The Silence of the Lambs won all 5 major Oscars in 1992. Best Picture, Director, Actress, Actor, and Adapted Screenplay. Only the 3rd film in history to accomplish that. And its most iconic character lands at number 6 on this list. There's a scene in Seven that you never see. A box arrives at the end of the film and the viewer never actually sees what's inside it, and yet it's one of the most disturbing moments in 1990s cinema. That says a great deal about the nature of the character who constructed it. John Doe doesn't appear in the Leistedt and Linkowski study, but he appears somewhere else that deserves equal attention. In 2012, Harvard Medical School's Science on Screen program used Seven as a case study on forensic psychology and insanity legislation. The presenter was Dr. Thomas Cathile, professor of psychiatry and co-founder of the program in psychiatry and the law at Harvard. A frontline academic forensic psychiatrist chose this film to talk about the real world. There's something there. John Doe's profile fits what criminology calls the organized mission killer. Someone who doesn't kill on impulse but to impose a value system, who plans months or years in advance, who considers his activity a mission of moral correction. That type of killer exists in documented criminal records. The difference between John Doe and real cases is the scale of his resources and the near implausible sophistication of his execution, which belong more to cinema than to FBI files. Audiences didn't know it at the time, but Kevin Spacey signed on with one condition the studio accepted without hesitation. His name would not appear in any promotional material or in the opening credits. The killer's appearance had to be a total surprise. David Fincher grossed $327 million on a $33 million budget, and the film's killer wasn't on the poster. There's a detail many viewers don't process the first time they watch the film. There are two killers in The Silence of the Lambs, and forensic science separates them by 4 spots on this list. James Gumb, Buffalo Bill, isn't the character most people remember from that film. Lecter dominates the memory, the conversation, the awards, and yet by the study's criteria, Gumb ranks considerably higher because his roots are in real documented cases that Lecter's aren't. FBI agent John Douglas, one of the first criminal profilers in history and the direct inspiration for the character of Jack Crawford in the film, personally advised Thomas Harris while writing the novel. Buffalo Bill didn't come from pure imagination. He came out of 3 case files. Ed Gein, who made objects from his victims' body parts in Wisconsin in the 1950s. Ted Bundy, whose injury-feigning victim abduction technique was described in detail by Bundy himself to FBI investigator Robert Keppel while he awaited execution on death row. And Gary Heidnik, who kept women captive in a basement in Philadelphia in the 1980s. The design of Buffalo Bill's basement in the film, including the pit where he keeps his victim, was directly inspired by Heidnik's documented facilities. The FBI cooperated with the production to the point of allowing filming at the real Quantico facilities. Several bureau agents appear in minor roles in the film. The character who gives the most chills and has the least screen time, the one viewers tend to forget in the face of Hopkins's presence, is the one who comes closest to documented criminal reality. 2 killers in the same film, completely different results when measured by science. Of the 126 characters the researchers analyzed across 400 films, only 21 were women. The study was unequivocal in its diagnosis of how cinema almost always represents female psychopathy, through sexuality as a weapon. The woman who uses other people's desire as a tool of control. The seductress, the one who destroys from the bedroom. Annie Wilkes does none of that, and that's why she's the most clinically accurate female portrait in the entire sample. Misery, Rob Reiner's adaptation of Stephen King's novel. Kathy Bates as the nurse who holds writer Paul Sheldon captive in her mountain home. What the study identifies in the character is a psychopathic variant the manuals call controlling obsessive. A completely consistent internal logic, the functional absence of empathy toward another's suffering, and the application of her own rules without deviation or weakness. Annie Wilkes doesn't act on impulse. She acts according to a code that only she fully understands, applying it with a coherence the viewer senses before they can put it into words. The detail few reviews of this film mention is the origin of the novel itself. King wrote it as a metaphor for his own relationship with addiction. Misery Chastain, the protagonist of the novels the Sheldon character writes, represented the substance. Paul Sheldon, trapped in the house, was King himself. The cage was the dependency. King later said he had no memory of writing the book. He was so deep in his addiction when he created it that the process fell outside his conscious memory. Kathy Bates won the Academy Award for Best Actress. It's the only role on this list to carry that distinction as the lead, and Annie Wilkes is the only woman in the top third of the scientific ranking. The oldest film on this list by 37 years, and the one that says the most about what cinema can do when it works with real material before the genres exist that would later pigeonhole it. M by Fritz Lang, 1931. Peter Lorre as Hans Beckert, a child murderer who wanders the streets of a German city, identified by a tune he whistles while he acts, drawn from Grieg's Peer Gynt Suite. A melody a blind balloon seller recognizes without seeing his face. The oldest film the forensic psychiatrists in the study found with enough clinical weight to cite as an example of accuracy. What the study identifies in Beckert is something horror cinema has rarely attempted: a killer who doesn't experience his compulsion as pleasure but as torment. The mirror scene where Beckert sees himself, the way the character unravels during the improvised trial the criminals stage in the basement. These articulate something modern criminology has confirmed in certain profiles of compulsive offenders: awareness of what they do without the capacity to stop it. That is clinically distinct from the psychopath who feels nothing. It's something more specific, more uncomfortable, and harder to turn into entertainment. And Fritz Lang captured it in 1931. Without forensic psychiatry manuals, without longitudinal studies on criminal behavior. The film was inspired by several real killers of the period, primarily Peter Kürten, known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, whose trial was underway as Lang finished the edit, and Fritz Haarmann. Lang worked from newspaper archives and the intuition that the most unsettling monster isn't the one without a conscience. It's the one who has one and can do nothing about it. Decades later, M appears in European forensic psychiatry training programs, not as a historical document, as an active teaching tool. The study's verdict is unanimous. Of 400 films and 126 characters evaluated with the PCL-R, the forensic psychiatrists pointed to Anton Chigurh, Javier Bardem's character in the Coen brothers' adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's novel, as the most clinically accurate portrait of a psychopath cinema has ever produced. And the reason isn't what he does, it's what he doesn't do. Chigurh doesn't monologue. He doesn't display his philosophy beyond what's strictly necessary for the viewer to understand he has one. He puts on no show. He takes no pleasure in others' suffering. He doesn't need to be understood or feared. He kills as a consequence of a system he has built and to which he remains faithful with a consistency that shows no visible cracks. The researchers write that the character appears invulnerable and impervious to any form of emotion or person. That is primary psychopathy as the PCL-R describes it. Not the cinema psychopath who looks at you and smiles. The real psychopath, for whom you simply do not exist as a morally relevant subject. What nobody mentions about the construction of this character is that the Coen brothers told Javier Bardem that Chigurh's haircut was historically authentic for 1970s Texas. It was completely invented. Bardem said in multiple interviews that it was the hardest element of the character to accept, and he refused to appear in public with that hair during filming to prevent any photographs before the film's release. And here's the detail that says it all. The study underscores that real psychopaths are not interesting in the way cinema has made them interesting for decades. They are emotionally flat, not dramatic, not theatrical. What makes Chigurh terrifying isn't what he says or what he thinks out loud. It's the certainty the viewer feels from the very first scene. That nothing you could say or do is going to change what he has already decided. That's what actual criminal records describe. Not Lecter's eloquence, not John Doe's philosophy. The total indifference of someone who has a system. And you are not part of that system. Javier Bardem, a Spanish actor, won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for this role. The film won 4 Oscars, including Best Picture, on a budget of $25 million and a worldwide gross of $171 million. The study's findings invert something cinema has been building for a century. The idea that a killer is more terrifying the more he talks, the more he explains, the more he looks at you. Lecter terrifies because he gives you his complete attention. Chigurh terrifies because he gives you none. What the forensic psychiatrist found across 400 films is that Hollywood has systematically chosen the version of fear that can be narrated. The killer who monologues has a plot. The killer who philosophizes has motivation. The killer who stares you down gives you something to hold on to, and that makes him manageable, even if he's also terrifying. The clinically real killer gives you none of that. He has no aesthetic, he has no speech prepared for you, he has a system, and that system doesn't include you as an audience. That's what makes real psychopathy almost impossible to film. There's no script possible for someone who has nothing to say to you. What remains unresolved after this video is a question the study itself never answers. If cinema has always preferred the more narratable version of evil, what does that say about us as viewers? Do we need the monster to be fascinating in order to look at it? Or are we simply incapable of fearing what we can no longer understand? Anton Chigurh has no answer for that question, and that precisely is the answer.